Piano hinges like this are the longest butt hinges you're ever going to install, and the process for doing it isn't that much different than the shorter variety. But I do think there are some ways to make the whole task easier and more foolproof, and in this video I'm going to show you how I do it. But in case you haven't used them, piano hinges are an excellent choice when you can spread the load out over a broad area, but the attachment surfaces are narrow. And that's why they're used to support those massive lids on grand pianos, and for that matter, the seats of the piano benches too. But they're also a good option for more common woodworking projects too. For example, I use them to hang the doors of this precision tool cabinet, which appears in the April 2023 issue of Woodworker's Journal. Now, because this is a pretty flashy project, I like the look of this much shiny brass on the inside. But these hinges are also going to ensure that these doors are going to swing smoothly and quietly over the life of the cabinet. And they're held in place with 24 screws. So there's no chance that these doors are going to sag out of alignment because they become loose on the hinges. Now let's get to the woodworking. For this hinge installation, let's pretend that these props are that cabinet and one door. We're going to use this scrap jig as a routing template for cutting the hinge mortises. It's just 3 pieces of plywood pocket screwed together, and I put a couple of pieces of sandpaper on it to keep the jig from moving around. And this inside measurement here matches the cut length of the hinge I want to install. And for that cabinet, the hinges are 23 3/4 inches long. I'm going to use this short piloted mortising bit with the template to route the hinge leaf mortises. The bit is short enough that I can set the cutter for a very shallow mortise while still having the pilot bearing roll along the template. A longer bit like this just wouldn't work. And here's how you set the depth of the mortise. It's not just the thickness of these thin hinge leaves, and here's why. When I close the hinge like this, the leaves don't meet flush. If they did, the depth of the mortise would be the thickness of the hinge leaf. For piano hinges, we have to think about the mortise depths differently. The mortise depth is actually the thickness of the hinge leaf plus half of this space in between them when the leaves are close parallel to one another like this. And if you don't account for that little space between the hinge leaves, the door or lid that you're installing won't sit flush on the carcass. There'll be a gap on the hinge side, and I don't think that looks very good. So for this piano hinge we're going to install here, I've measured the space between the hinge leaves, and the depth of the mortise is going to be 1/16 of an inch. And just to be clear, that's 1/16 of an inch below the thickness of the template. We need to lay out the mortises on the door and the cabinet in order to line up the routing template. So let's do that next. The width of the mortise is just the width of the hinge leaf from the edge to the knuckle, and I've already got that distance set with this marking tool. But you could also use a marking gauge and knife the layout lines, or you could measure and mark off the end of an adjustable square. Here I'm marking the hinge layouts on both my mock door and the cabinet. I like to use a mechanical pencil with a lead that draws a thin, even line for tasks like this. I mark the ends of the mortises too. With that done, we're all set to route the mortises. Just line up the template carefully with the mortise layout lines and clamp both the template and the workpiece securely to a bench so nothing can shift out of place. Then start the router and feed it so the bit's pilot bearing rolls along the template's inside edges. You can see that the short end legs of my template provide automatic starting and stopping points for routing, so there's no chance of error. Now we just need to square up the ends of the mortise where the bit couldn't reach with a sharp chisel. Now repeat the same measuring, marking, and routing process to cut the other hinge leaf mortise. Well, the mortising is done, but we still need to measure and cut the hinge to length. And I'm going to use this little cordless angle grinder and an abrasive cutoff wheel to do that, but a hacksaw would work fine too. But I don't want to just measure off of one end of the hinge and lop off the rest, and here's why. If I were just to measure off the end of the hinge like this, my cutoff line might not leave me with the same amount of material here next to the endmost hole as here. And in fact, in this case, it won't. There's an inch of material down here and only about 5/8 of an inch here. You want those endmost holes of the hinge to be evenly spaced. That way the hinge will look like it was meant to be that way. So on my hinge here for 23 3/4 of an inch, I'm going to be taking a little bit of material off the end and making my other cut up here. That way my endmost holes will be balanced. Even though I have to cut the hinge in 2 places, that's not hard to do with a tool like this. When the hinge is cut to length, file or grind the ends square and smooth. We're down to the last step, attaching the hinge to both components. Here I'm fastening the hinge to the door frame first. Use a self-centering bit to make sure each screw pilot hole is centered. Attach a few screws along the length of the hinge to tack it in place. Then attach the other hinge leaf to the cabinet carcass the same way with a few screws. Now check the action of the hinge to make sure that everything is working right. And this is. So now I'm going to go back and drive screws into every hinge hole to complete the installation. Piano hinges are an attractive and sturdy solution for lids and doors. They come in several widths, lengths, metals, and finishes. Keep them in mind as another hinge option in your hardware arsenal. I'm Chris Marshall with Woodworker's Journal magazine in Rockler, and thanks for watching.